Hey everybody, here is Roberto Varese at the GFCC. I'm really happy to have today here with me Chad Holliday, who's the chairman of the GFCC and who also is the chairman of the board for Royal Dutch Shell. Chad is a well-known global business leader, but he has been involved not just in business all over the globe, but also, I would say, in global causes and global initiatives. He is the co-chair of the UN Energy for All initiative that really addresses one of the key infrastructure challenges that we have, that is to provide access to people around the globe to electricity and power. Yeah. This year we'll be talking about infrastructure at the GFCC meeting, really trying to explore how infrastructures impact competitiveness in two ways: how they impact cost structures, or maybe the lack of infrastructures create costs in societies, in economies, but also how infrastructures can be enablers for value creation or the investments in infrastructure. Yeah. So, Chad, thanks a lot for joining us. We are really happy that you'll be with us in Saudi Arabia, in the King Abdullah Economic City, and we're really happy to have you here today. So, maybe in order for us to get started with this, what do you see as the most relevant, let's say, the most critical areas in which we need to make progress in terms of deploying infrastructures in the world today? And how do they impact competitiveness?
Roberto, first, thank you very much and congratulations on your new assignment and role as our president. It's a very critical role, and we're just delighted that you're doing this and looking forward to the first meeting you'll be leading here as we go forward. Uh, Infrastructure is the backbone of all we need to do. I think we understand that, and that's why the meeting's focused on it. Uh, I think access to electricity is what the Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, is the golden thread. If you have access to electricity, then you can have access to water. Then you can have modern transportation systems. Then you can have education systems that work. If you don't have access to modern electrical systems, that so many people in the world take for granted, it's a major problem. And the 1.3 billion people that don't have access to that is clear. But if you have access, but it's unreliable and you can't depend on it, that's an issue too. So I think that's the cornerstone, and then we have to build out everything else to go with it.
Uh, so that really has something to say to developing economies. Yeah. But there is also a growing debate on in the investments that are needed in infrastructures for advanced economies like here in the United States and Europe. Yeah, and also there are lots of transformations in technologies that in two ways can are connected to that. In the one hand, maybe they could help us to lower the costs of investments in infrastructures. Yeah, and in the other hand, let's say emerging or new technologies from solar to biotechnology could also be fostered through investments in infrastructure. How do you see that happening in the world today?
Well, I think there are two big realities that we must face. First, there's a movement to cities, and the cities must be ready for it. There's been talk for over a decade about how more and more people are moving to cities. So we must design the new cities, which it can be in developing or developed countries, more likely developing. But we have to take the developed country cities and we must repurpose them for the new use. So just to take a very simple element around mass transportation, bus rapid transit. So dedicating a lane for buses that can go fast and don't have to be clogged up with the cars. You take away a lane from cars, maybe the cars stay at home, and people take the bus rapid transit because it's just a more effective way of doing it. So cities must understand they have to put in the systems that attract them. They also have to understand that their existing infrastructure, if it was built 50 years ago, is now obsolete. And there's new technology, and they got to make those investments. I know that's difficult sometimes for governments to step up and do, but it's absolutely necessary.
Uh, let's say, which are maybe some of the global initiatives or the examples that you see that could be highlighted in terms of addressing those challenges and at the same time taking advantage the opportunities that are around in terms of, let's say, new technologies or new solutions, as you just mentioned?
So I travel to London frequently these days, and the most frequently thing discussed is the new high-speed bicycle paths that are being built in London. Mostly negatively because people that I'm talking to are riding in a car and they don't like the fact there's construction going on. But there is a major step forward for that. I hope, and London has planned that well. I hope high-speed bicycle paths are what will really be used and will really be needed in that environment. But I think cities must do the planning job to be sure that they anticipate what's needed in their arenas. And then second, go ahead and make the investment to put them in. Now, I think the actual investment could be public-private partnerships. I think if a jurisdiction cannot get the tax revenue, can't invest themselves, I think they can find private companies that are willing to make the investment and get the revenue over a period of time and finance it.
And what are the, let's say, what are the improvements that are needed in financial tools to make PPPs happen and to mobilize, let's say, private capitals to investments in infrastructure? And as your comments really highlight this nexus between the development of new infrastructures and sustainability in some way. Yeah. So, do you believe that we are mature, that we have around the globe an infrastructure or maybe a financial infrastructure that is needed to support those investments today? What do we need to do in terms to make progress in creating that infrastructure to fund new investments in infrastructure?
Good question. So you mentioned earlier our work with Sustainable Energy for All with the United Nations. And there's a financing wing of that. And actually, Bank of America, working with the Brazilian Development Bank, has been key in leading that work. And what we found is that the instruments that are needed for these infrastructure projects really don't exist. So you have people that want to invest money in projects like this, but they are not lined up with the right terms and conditions for the cities and states and provinces that want to do it. So it's just a mixed match. But there's no lack of cash, there's no lack of projects. They're just not properly linked up. And so Sustainable Energy for All is taking steps to do that. The so-called green bonds are an example of that, where people have focused for sustainability, but I think any infrastructure we're putting in now should be sustainable. It should deal with the climate change issues that we have in the world. So I think that's very possible. I think the second thing is we're on the verge of major technology change. Many developed cities in the world now have this thing called Uber, which is so much more efficient than a taxi cab driving around, looking to find somebody standing on the street. The car can sit somewhere and wait and just be dispatched immediately without all the really unnecessary and inefficient infrastructure in between in most taxi cabs. So I think if you take a technology like that can really improve the existing infrastructure, and then you marry it to the other technologies that are critical. So as people know, Uber has different rates depending on the demand. There are also high-speed expressways now in cities. They have different rates depending on the demand. So when it's clogged, they take the rate up and the clogging goes away. So I think there's some very simple ways to marry infrastructure with communications technology to really make a difference.
Yeah, and that is really connected, let's say, to the Internet of Things and then put in different layers of, let's say, information technology. I understand from your comment that we really can tap into the potential of new technologies in order to make, let's say, to be more efficient in terms of using the capital expenditure that is made in infrastructures around the globe. Yeah. Do you see that something that can happen in developing economies or something that is really taking place in advanced economies? I mean, is that a reality for emerging markets or a concrete possibility in your perspective today?
Oh, I think it's absolutely a possibility because developing markets can leapfrog. And we look at what's happened in the continent of Africa around cell phones. From 30 years ago, two-thirds of the continent had never heard a phone ring, to now two-thirds of the continent has access to cell phone. And not necessarily having their own personal one, but they have access to it. So it's a major change and can, in a way, move ahead of some of the developed economies in what they're doing. But it takes planning. It takes looking things through completely. Take water, for example. We haven't talked as much about water, but proper planning for a city, you should reuse the water multiple times. So you shouldn't think about taking it out of the stream once and putting it right back in. You should use it for industrial uses, city uses, and other maybe agricultural uses. And so a total planning system for a city that's possible to reuse water is really critical.
Yeah. So, and in that context, let's say not just technologies, but business models will be needed to make those things work. Let's say autonomous water systems or off-grid power systems that could be deployed in remote areas of the let's say of the planet. Yeah, which are the opportunities that, let's say, emerging countries could tap on in terms of leapfrogging, as you said, and making progress in value creation, the development of new industries, connecting that with investments in infrastructures. Is that something real? Is that a real opportunity in that?
I think it's definitely a real opportunity, but I do think it's very situational specific.
Okay.
So where biofuels may play in one place, they don't work at all in another. Solar may play for electrical system and would not work in another place. So I think it's hard to generalize. I do think if you look at personalized transportation, some people would call it cars, but I recall 10 years ago at the 2005 World's Fair in Japan, Toyota rolled out a vehicle. I actually rode in the vehicle that was a one-person car. And you would program in the location you wanted to go, and it would take you there. And so you didn't have all the metal and steel and bumpers because they were programmed so they couldn't run into each other. And looking at that and doing it, people thought it was so far out and never be practical. Now, if you look at the reports in the last a couple years about Google and Apple having their own personal driverless vehicle, this wasn't driver. It was in Japan. It was a rider. It wasn't a driver. So what we're seeing is that technology is almost here. Now, it's not here today, but it will be within 10 years. So if I was in a developing country and I wanted to build out the personalized transportation system, why not leapfrog to something like what Toyota has proposed and now what Apple and so forth are working on? Why don't they think about that big step and so they'll be ahead of the developed countries rather than trying to put in the same system that we have in developed countries today? So that would be my challenge. I know that sounds stretchy. It sounds like too big a leap, but why not?
Yeah. And your comment makes me think about one thing, that probably technology is really not constraining us today, but institutional models for the adoption of new technologies and for the implementation of new businesses. Probably that's one of the areas in which policy frameworks and institutional frameworks, but probably those are key issues for us to make progress in order to enable those developments, new businesses, and new technologies to be deployed. Yeah, do you see like that?
Yeah, I see exactly that. And I think you said it quite well. And we saw that in Sustainable Energy for All. We went to developing countries and said, we want to work with you, but you have to develop a plan first. You have to be able to describe what you're going to do. Then we would evaluate the plan and give them feedback. So we had some countries that had a history of electrical systems going in and people not paying their bills, and there'd be no enforcement, no mechanism to make sure they paid their bills. So nobody's going to invest in an electrical system or a water system or a roadway system in a country where the legal system isn't caught up and people don't have to pay the bills. So we gave them the proof points they had to meet, either by direct metering and paying on the spot or something else that would be necessary before we could get together a consortium of development banks, commercial banks, and companies to put in the infrastructure. So I think this is not rocket science, but you wouldn't believe how many countries just don't have that in place, but somehow expect the development funds to flow.
Yeah. So for us to finish this conversation that will be continued in Saudi Arabia, as we prepare ourselves for the GFCC annual meeting in the King Abdullah Economic City, what would you say in terms of the nexus between competitiveness and infrastructure? That is let's say, probably the most important thing to which we should pay attention at this moment when we talk about competitiveness and infrastructure.
Planning. If I had to put it in one word, it needs to plan. It needs to plan with a far enough time horizon. Infrastructure doesn't move very easily. So we have to take the time, and cities must learn from other cities, provinces from other provinces, of what's been effective and what hasn't been effective. And so I think a hard look at planning up front before you start pouring cement, if you will. And generally, people get excited about projects. They have the funding suddenly, so they rush out to do the project. So I'd say every municipality should be doing planning now, and then they put in the structure over a period of time that makes sense.
Chad, thank you so much for your time. We are really excited that you join us in Saudi Arabia. And you all stay tuned, and this conversation is to be continued. Yeah, thank you so much.
So, thank you very much. Great.